Before we get started, I don't know how many of you have been here each of the nights that we've done this. The first night, Israel had mentioned that there's no animosity here. And given some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight and the way that I need to talk about them, I wanted to kind of reiterate that. If I thought that Christians are stupid, I wouldn't bother. I wouldn't be here to talk to people. If I thought people were incapable of understanding, I certainly wouldn't waste my time. I've got video games. I got a wife, which I probably should have mentioned before video games. So while there are things that I'm going to say that many people are inevitably, unavoidably going to look at as arrogant, condescending, dismissive, elitist, intellectual, I will own all of that and say that, yes, I understand that it can be viewed that way. Just understand that there's no intent to direct it that way. And my animosity that I express is for ideas and actions and not necessarily individuals. I don't ever sum up the entirety of one person with a single label. Oh, that person's stupid. Well, okay, we're all stupid about something at some point. And it would be very stupid of me to assume that that's a summation of character. So I'm ready, I guess. So tonight we're discussing where morality comes from. And as we've seen in the previous nights, we're probably going to get hung up once again on what words mean, and maybe even talk about time travel, although I doubt it. I hope we can avoid some of the discussion about what words mean and actually talk more about the concepts, because they're important, irrespective of what you call them. But I need to start tonight by taking a step back, based on things that I've seen and heard throughout the day, and to say that, and I might get preachy, which you're used to, but I have no problem with ignorance. Ignorance can be cured. The cure for ignorance is education. It's how all of us got to understand what we understand. And I don't think any of us would proclaim to know everything, or there are people who know more than me, even if they're not smarter, and there are people who are smarter than me, even if they don't know as much. I do, though, have a huge problem with willful ignorance. I have a huge problem with the celebration of ignorance and the encouragement of others to be willfully ignorant. When Don McElroy, the former head of the State Board of Education, famously said in regard to teaching evolution in schools, "We need someone to stand up to the experts," he was nearly universally derided. Today, we heard a similar sentiment being expressed, coupled with a parade of logical fallacies and a flat assertion that if science doesn't point to God, he has no use for it. Not all of you will agree. I would hope that none of you would agree. He scoffed at the scientists with their $20 words and degrees and years of studies. Why, they don't even know what the word theory means. And how dare they tell us or the word nothing. How dare they tell us we haven't reached their level? Well, you haven't. If you haven't spent the time and put in the effort to study these things at the level that these individuals have, it's just a fact. You don't have that level. Doesn't mean you're wrong. But it means we have to talk about how we're going to challenge these ideas, and any idea can be challenged by anybody. But if a scientist tells you that when they use the word theory, and let's just go ahead and replace that with scientific theory so that the labels aren't confusing, that this is a graduation point of an idea, that there is nothing higher in science that anything can aspire to. There's no scientific law. Laws are in mathematics. Theory is it. Theory is as high as you get. And that this isn't just an educated guess. It is not the equivalent of there's a theory I could jump off this building and float. It's not just a guess plus time. It is the result of testing, validation, falsification, the rigid attempts to demonstrate that it is wrong. And by the way, a hypothesis has no merit if it is unfalsifiable, if it is impossible to prove it wrong. Peer review, which is not just having my buddies look at it and saying, yeah, that looks good, which is the process of attempting to show that it's wrong and that it's reproducible. And it's the system that consistently produces demonstrably reliable results, makes predictions that are useful, unlike the young earth creationist model, which does not make testable predictions. And if your response to that is that they're simply using the word theory wrong, you have deceived yourself and you have avoided the subject because you have not in any way offered a response to what they're actually talking about. You have allowed the language to get in the way of the concept. I've seen ministers up here acknowledge that they have no expertise in a particular scientific field, that they don't understand it, that it's beyond their grasp, and not a few seconds later they are deriding that same science and calling it ridiculous. If you want to know about science, maybe you should talk to the people who actually have the expertise in it. They dismiss dating methods that show an ancient universe while embracing those same methods to date Göbekli Tepe. It's cherry picking. They reject the same foundations of biology that they use in medicine when they need treatment. The truth of the evolutionary process is demonstrated in the effectiveness of vaccines. It's a bit like saying that a yardstick is a fine measurement for a bolt of fabric or a football field, but not for really big things. Yes, we have different units so that we can deal with smaller numbers, but you can measure the number of yards between here and the moon. Objecting to a method, and that's what science is, a method, while making use of it when it suits you, is dishonest. There's been a lot of science denial this weekend, and some of it has been in the guise of actually embracing science. That's really disconcerting to me. There are, though, and I would point out that, I skipped this part, they're doing this while simultaneously, the ministers that are getting up here and saying I don't have an expertise in science, but I'm going to tell you why it's wrong, are doing it while simultaneously deriding scientists for not having an expertise in the Bible and demonstrating that it's wrong. Hypocrisy knows no bounds. There are, though, atheists and scientists who do have expertise in the Bible and who reject the claims of theism and atheism and Christianity. And despite claims to the contrary, they do attack and deal with Islam and other religions. All the classical arguments, the cosmological argument, etc., aren't tied to Christianity. These are tied to the top-level theistic proposition. And if anybody follows Richard Dawkins on Twitter, you can be rest assured he's gone after Islam rigorously. And if you don't think atheists are going after Islam, you should maybe look into Maryam Mazi and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and the fact that Sam Harris addressed it in The End of Faith. The idea that any of us are scared to say that Islam is a vile religion that is committing atrocities on its adherents is absurd. I've said it. Do I deal with it all the time? No, because Islam doesn't affect my life that much. It's not my area of expertise, and I live in the United States where I'm primarily dealing with Christians and Christianity and my background. And so I also do a call-in show, so we tend to talk about whatever the callers are talking about. There are people who are experts in the Bible who aren't Christians. Biblical scholars like Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier. There are ministers from nearly every denomination you could name who are atheists, and some of them are stuck in the pulpit preaching what they don't believe, and their congregation has no idea. They have joined a collective known as the Clergy Project, which is for active and former ministers who have lost their faith and who are choosing to, most of them, remain anonymous. My friend Jerry DeWitt is, they called him the first graduate of the Clergy Project, but he doesn't like that. He was the first one to come out of anonymity. He wrote a book called Hope After Faith. Jerry loves people in a way that is sickening to me. I love people. I care about people. I genuinely do. I've never met anybody who genuinely loves every other human being he's ever met more than Jerry DeWitt. And he's a godless heathen. Pentecostal pastor for many years. You can read his book and have him talk and interact with him. He knows his Bible. He just doesn't happen to agree with it. Which brings us back to this question that we dealt with the other night about interpretation and the reliability of the Bible. Because the claim is that these people who have come to a different conclusion just haven't read it properly or interpreted it properly. Jamie Coots is dead. Anybody know who that is? He was on a reality TV show called A Snake Salvation. He's a snake handling preacher in Kentucky. He took literally his understanding of Mark 16, that section of Mark 16, 9 through 20, which, by the way, doesn't exist in the oldest and best manuscripts, and some people would argue it's a forgery. I don't know. I don't care. I care whether or not it's true, whether it was inserted after or not. I care what it means, because that might have some value. But when it says, they shall take up serpents, Jamie Coots took that literally. And for years, he carried serpents in his church. And every time he did, he would dance around with this snake. And to everybody sitting there in the pew, it was absolute confirmation that he was filled with the Spirit because he didn't get bit. And I know, talking to Church of Christ folks, none of you are surprised that he eventually got bit and died, most likely. Most of you probably think he was severely misguided and misunderstood that passage, and that his refusal of medical treatment, which was also a tenet of his faith, was even dumber than handling snakes in the first place. And I'd agree, so there's something we can agree on. But last night I had a discussion with Joshua about a passage in Exodus where God is delivering these plagues onto Egypt, and after the plagues, Pharaoh repents and then hardens his heart. But that's not what the Bible says happens. What the Bible actually says happens is it said, I, the Lord, have hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is the literal word for word. And the Lord comes to Moses and Aaron and says that I, the Lord, have hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it goes on, and Pharaoh repents, and then it says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And I had a problem with this. It seems to me like a violation of his free will. It seems to me like Pharaoh did actually repent. And Joshua corrected me, gave me what his understanding of the interpretation, or his understanding of what that passage means was that God didn't actually harden Pharaoh's heart, that he maybe arranged the circumstances so that Pharaoh would harden his own heart. But what the passage says, on a plain reading, is the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. If the literal, clear reading can be interpreted in the exact opposite way, where are we? If the passage says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and the correct interpretation is that the Lord didn't harden Pharaoh's heart, but that he allowed Pharaoh to harden his own heart, why didn't it just say that in the first place? If the passage says they shall take up serpents, and that wasn't actually the intent for everybody forever, maybe it should have said that in there. Maybe there should have been more clarification. Maybe Jamie made a horrible mistake and didn't read some other passages that he could have used for clarification. I don't know. The religious moral argument in every version that I've ever seen, I don't know if this will apply tonight, is a fallacious appeal to consequences. Wow, what's that? Last night I said, if you get nothing else out of this, take this away. Forget that. If you get nothing else out of this weekend, take this away. I implore you, I beg you, don't give up your religion. Don't take science. Don't set aside science. Set aside the claims of science. And for some period of time, set aside your Bible. You can go back to it. It's not going anywhere. Nothing's changing. And spend some time understanding the structure of logical arguments. Spend some time examining why we know there's 256 logical syllogisms, which ones of them are valid and why, so that you understand fallacious arguments. This is the foundation of all reasoning and all thought. And it is correct and true. And if the Bible is correct and true, then it will withstand being placed into syllogistic form and evaluated. Because I've heard some rather terrible, obvious fallacies over the course of the weekend. It can't hurt you. Can't hurt anybody to take a few minutes, a little bit longer than that, and actually investigate the logical absolutes, the structure of syllogisms, and how you identify fallacies, because we are terrible at it. And the reason that we have syllogisms is to make it easier to identify the fallacies. Because when you have an argument that's placed in conversational form, it's really hard. And if it's placed in a conversational form where you already have some motivation to believe, it may be virtually impossible. You have to pull it out of context. The objection, I don't know how many were here for Gabriel's talk at the end of the session before dinner. Gabriel and I aren't very far apart on our view of morality and how you can get to morality. It seems to me that the sticking point between our views, and I'll talk more about my view in just a minute, is whether or not there is an absolute source, whether or not there needs to be an absolute source, and whether or not that source is God. As far as the mechanics of building secular idea or a moral system from purely secular means, Our thoughts on that aren't greatly different. But the objection in the moral argument seems to be, if there is no God, then there is no absolute standard. What's the second premise in that argument? If it's, I'm not going to go through the deconstruction here because it would just confuse people. The argument seems to be, if there is no God, there is no absolute standard for morality, and I don't want to live in a world where there's no absolute standard for morality, therefore, there's a God. And friends, the world you want to live in has no impact on the world that you actually do live in. And that's why there's a potential fallacy in almost every formulation of that moral argument. There may or may not be an absolute standard, but if there is, you need to demonstrate why it needs to be a God after you've demonstrated that there needs to be a standard. The claim is that we must have a God to point to settle the disagreements about the things we all already know. That if there is no God to point to, that I can have this view of morality and you can have this view of morality, and we're just going to keep disagreeing. We have no way of settling it. Well, guess what? If I have this view of morality and you point to a God, you haven't settled a thing. We are no closer to agreeing because I don't accept your authority. I don't accept the authority that you're pointing to. It does not solve the problem that people are claiming that it solves. We have a fiat money system in the United States. We used to have a gold standard. I'm sure a lot of people would like to go back to gold standard. It seems really absolute. No, it's not. Gold doesn't have a value intrinsic to gold. It's based on its rarity. It's based on its demand. It's based on what we said. And the fact that we have this fiat money system doesn't mean that we can't tell real currency from fake currency. And it doesn't mean that we can't determine that something is overpriced or underpriced. We may quibble in the difference, but if you tell me you've got a pencil that costs $2 billion, you're nuts. And I don't need to point to a God or a government standard to show that that's the case. And neither would you. Secular moral systems, by appealing to reality, use the demonstrable facts about physical reality as the only absolute that they would point to. Yes, it is still a situational system of morality, that each situation needs to be judged independently, and I can't think of any other way that it could possibly work, and I don't think anybody else could either. We all accept that the situation matters. There's a reason why the laws about killing someone in the United States aren't simply thou shalt not kill. You know how many different types of murder there are and qualifying things? It's because we recognize that if you run over and you hit somebody with your car, that's very different from intentionally picking up a loaded weapon, loading it, walking in and shooting them. There is a difference. There's a situational difference. It's not just about the result. There's also the motivations and the circumstances to consider. When Katrina hit and people were looting to stay alive, were they stealing? You betcha. They were absolutely stealing. How immoral was it? Was it just as immoral? If somebody has a heart attack in front of a drugstore that's closed, how immoral is it to break through that window and get the defibrillators or the medicine that they need? Are those equivalent? You can't have this in a simplistic, non-situational moral system. My model, which, by the way, isn't necessarily right. I have ideas about morality. I might be wrong. I'm okay with the idea that there being, for any given situation, a moral absolute. We are physical beings in a physical world. There are truths to be discovered about how reality impacts us. These truths are part of physical reality, and we evaluate the consequences of actions with respect to well-being. And I'll get back to well-being in a minute. I don't know how much time I got left, but battery acid is bad for you. I don't know if that's news to anybody, but if you tried to drink battery acid, probably bad. What if we found somebody that it wasn't bad for? Does that mean that we were wrong? No. Just like peanuts are pretty good, but boy, there's some people who have a really bad reaction to peanuts. This idea that there is a universal truth about something for every situation and every individual is one that is simply denied by reality. What we're talking about are general truths. And we need to accept this, because when we get outside of those general things, those things that are obvious, this idea that it seems obvious to us that just running around, walking into a church and blowing everybody away is obviously wrong, but there may be other areas where there's a little more quibble room, where we're trying to understand. Today we heard that you learn your morality from your parents, and then they from their parents, and they from their parents, and this goes on back and back. So where did the first ones get it from? Well, clearly, according to the Bible, it's handed down to Adam and Eve by God. They've got an account here that purportedly goes from the beginning to us. The problem is that's not how you learn about morality. Yes, your parents teach you, but you add to it. My parents added to what their parents had. Their parents added to what their parents had. That's how we learn and grow. That's the value of this system. We can figure out where we were wrong in the past. We are better moral creatures than our ancient ancestors were. We're far from perfect, and we make lots of mistakes, but we understand more. So what was it at the beginning? Well, my contention is that you can begin with very simple and obvious things as general principles. Life is generally preferable to death. Now, I don't say that that's true in every situation. I'm actually in favor of people dying with dignity when their condition has worsened to the point where continuing to live is, to them, worse than dying. But as a general rule, life is preferable to death. And we know this is true because we're alive. If you thought that death was preferable to life, you have removed yourself from the discussion if you're sincere about it. If you think that death's preferable to life, you're done, you're gone. You're not a part of the conversation anymore, and we don't have to worry about your opinion, which is convenient. What other principles? Health is generally preferable to sickness. I'd say almost always preferable to sickness, but there may be some benefits that come out of getting sick. You may become stronger. You may strengthen your resistance to certain things. Pleasure is generally preferable to pain. Not always. Sometimes pain's good. Sometimes pain's necessary. You can tell your kid all day, don't put your hand on that stove. As soon as they do and they feel the pain, boy, that's a good way to learn a lesson. Pain tells you when something's wrong. The thing about secular moral systems that make appeal to reality and don't try to go further is that they recognize our limitations, and the attempt is to construct a methodology, not a why, but a methodology for answering the difficult questions about how we live. It doesn't benefit me at all for someone to say, there is a standard and that standard is God, because that carries no weight until we agree that this is the standard that we are going to share. There may be a God, I might disagree with him. Later on, maybe during a rebuttal, I might address some of the things in the Bible that I find objectionable, since the Bible is often cited as a great moral guide. I don't agree. We were asked today, why do atheists care? Why do they argue against a fantasy that is a waste of time? Why can't they just let us waste our time? Because what you believe, what we each believe, affects all of us. Your beliefs don't live in a vacuum in your brain. Your beliefs affect every other potential belief you will ever form because they are formed by the logical processes. And if those are flawed and have led you to a flawed belief, that is a cascading failure that will lead to future beliefs that are false. It's not a waste of time. It's not just, if religious people, not all of them, not even you guys, were to just have their beliefs and live off segregated somewhere, there would be very little complaint. But there still would be, and there still should be. Because no matter how segregated you think you are, we are stuck here on this planet. And your beliefs have an impact on the people around you, whether you realize it or not. And the other aspect of this is that we care about other people. We are empathetic beings. While I'm fine with some limited idea of selfishness, and you can actually make an argument that pure selfishness can lead to this idea of morality, which I'll kind of touch on, we don't have to be selfish. We have the capacity for mercy and compassion. We can exercise those things. We do. And even if we can do them for selfish reasons. We can do them because we recognize that this makes the world better and that we are more likely to be recipients of mercy and compassion. We are propagating a mindset that benefits us. The last thing I want to hit, because I'm probably almost out of time. If there is no God, we heard today, why am I concerned about the well-being of society? If God doesn't obligate me to care, why should I? I've heard this over and over again. I heard it this morning. The answer is simple: because you're a part of society. It breaks my heart to hear people say, if there was no God, I'd run around raping and killing. I've had people tell me that. If they found out there was no God, they'd go around raping and killing. That breaks my heart. I don't know how to reach them. I think they're all reachable. If they're not, I want to keep your butt in church and keep believing, because that's obviously that's the only thing that's going to keep you safe, the rest of us safe. But I think they're reachable. You're a part of society, we all are, and we're stuck here because we're empathetic beings, because it's in our best interest, because we're going to grow and understand more about morality than our ancestors did. Well, you have no ultimate authority to point to. I have reality. That's all I can point to until something else is demonstrated. Well, yeah, but without this ultimate authority, we can't settle any arguments. We can't settle any arguments even if there is an ultimate authority, until you actually accept that authority. So trying to cite a God, no matter which one it is, no matter if it's the true one, doesn't do anything to solve the problem. We are stuck here, and we're going to have the conversations. And if we can't get past the simple conversations about morality, the things that are obvious to both of us, and yet we argue about why they're obvious to both of us, we are never going to make headway on the difficult, really difficult discussions that are coming down the pipe that deal with the nature of identity and the path that humanity is going to continue to go down. Our future is amazing as long as we don't screw it up. And the more time that we spend, well, why? I'm interested in why. Why would be helpful, would be wonderful, but if we can't come to an agreement on it, at least we can come to an agreement that we are stuck here in this physical universe, and that there are truths that we recognize, and that there are real facts about who we are, and that the well-being of individuals and societies, while they may be in conflict, doesn't make the problem intractable. For any given situation, there's a finite set of actions, and because we can compare them, there necessarily must be some set of one or more actions for that situation that represent the moral pinnacle, and that's what Sam Harris was talking about in the moral landscape. And while I don't agree with him on everything, our moral views are very similar. I heard today that science can't tell us anything about morality because you can't put morality in a beaker or a centrifuge. Man, science is so much more than beakers and centrifuge.
Certainly is good to be with each of you tonight as we enter into the final part of this 3-day religious discussion. Tomorrow will be more of summary and making some final conclusions to the discussions that have already taken place. But I want to begin by reminding everyone that as we spoke in these last 2 nights to prepare for tonight, we were building on a particular thought. And in the first night, we asked the question, what is more rational, an eternal God or eternal matter? And when we considered the evidence on both sides, it is my conviction that the evidence leaned more in favor for an eternal God. What was Matt's response to this question? I don't know. And then he proceeded to explain, at least as far as he could, to give an answer to the metaphysical question concerning our origin. And we dealt and spent some time discussing consciousness. And his response was, I don't know. We transition over to the next night, and there the question moves from the realm of origins into a more specific type of origin, and that is, does the human being possess the power to imagine God? The question itself was, is God a figment of man's imagination, or is God invented by man? Matt began yesterday by saying, I don't know. And so in both nights, we looked at some very careful and logical arguments. Last night, I attempted to summarize the first night, and we put before each of us that we have before us two sources of information. We have what is often referred to by those who appeal to science, what is called empirical evidence. This is evidence that appeals to the five senses. These are things that are primarily tangible and concrete. And then, of course, there is another way to prove things, and that is through reasoned argumentation. Things that are argued logically from one point to another point. And as long as there is consistency, then we understand that it is possible to build what in law is referred to as a prima facie case. And so while we understand as Christians that God cannot be proven empirically, we do not concede the point that God cannot be proven at all, because God is proven logically. He is proven as a logical necessity. Without the concept of God, nothing else can make sense. Nothing else will make sense. And it's not sufficient to say, I don't know. Now, when we look at the Bible and we begin to talk about whence cometh morals, and we begin to lay the foundation for this discussion, it's important that we make certain that we understand, as I've been mentioning, and as I have mentioned several times before, that with regard to all human knowledge, it can be categorized in 5 categories under the heading of philosophy. Philosophy just simply means the love of wisdom. And we have a discussion of metaphysics, of epistemology, of logic, of ethics, and aesthetics. And everything that we know about ourselves falls under one of those categories. And I was careful to point out that if we do not get our metaphysics right, then it directly affects our epistemology. If we cannot answer satisfactorily the origin question, then how can we depend on our process of epistemology? Because the origin question gives considerable weight to our process of epistemology. Epistemology is based wholly on our ability to reason. But if I cannot explain where reason came from in the first place, then I'm already beginning blind. And I'm not certain that my epistemological process in determining truth, and that's even if I believe truth. And of course, the question was posed to Matt again, and he said, I don't know about truth. And so there is this dancing around of origins, of consciousness, of truth, all these things that are necessary in order for us to be able to know anything about ourselves. Otherwise, the alternative is anarchy and chaos. Now, when we look at morality, morality is a system by which we measure the rightness and the wrongness of whatever it is that we are considering. To say that one is moral is to say, based upon the definition of that particular term, that he or she has the capacity to differentiate between whatever it is before him or her and to determine with accuracy what is right and what is wrong. Now, Matt spent a few moments discussing things that are good versus things that are bad, and he gave some principles, but he's jumping ahead in the argument. How do we determine anything to be good or bad in the first place? What is our standard? And listening to him speak, he would say that the standard is our logical ability. He encouraged us to spend time studying logical argumentation. And he says, study the nature of logic and syllogistic reasoning. And then as he attempted to explain in logical form morality, he chose not to deconstruct the argument because he said it would be too confusing. And so, at one moment he says, study it. He says it would take a few minutes, perhaps maybe even more. Anybody who's even studied any form of logic knows that it's going to take much more than a few minutes. It takes years. And there are people even at this very moment who have studied logic and they still don't understand it, because it goes back to the process of reason, and reason is a very complex system. And so he asks us to study logic and then fails to use logic to determine what is before us with regard to the origin of life, with regard to whether God is a human invention and where morality comes from. He assumes the logical process by which he formulates his morality, when he cannot even answer that to begin with. Now, according to the Bible, as we turn to the Bible and remember, morality, a system by which we measure the rightness or wrongness of whatever it is that we're considering. Moral means our ability to differentiate between right and wrong. So morality is directly tied into the first question that we discussed and the second question. Logically, we have to go back to God, or else we end up with nothing. Can nothing produce something? That is illogical. The second night was, man does not have the ability to invent God. If we study the nature of the mind and we focus in on imagination, man's imagination does not have the capacity to invent the God of the Bible. And as we understand those arguments and allow them to settle, we will understand the force of that reasoning. So that in this night, without the first and the second answered questions, or the first and second questions answered properly, we cannot begin to discuss morality. And so, as we have given evidence for God in a logical manner, we begin with God. And the Bible says in a medley of passages why God is the radex of morality. And it not only states that as a fact, it demonstrates the process as to how he is that way. A moment ago, Matt confused the stating of a fact with the process of how something is accomplished. He mentioned the book of Exodus and he talked about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. That's what the Bible says. It's a fact. But in that text, it does not tell you how God did it. And when you look at the text, sometimes the biblical text will state facts, and the remote context has to be considered in order to determine the process. In other passages, the Bible says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Are we going to literally pluck out our eye when it causes us to sin? Any thinking person understands that that is figurative language. And all language is either literal or figurative. But for some reason, those who oppose religion classify us all as literalists. And they think we are buffoons, they think we are ignoramuses, that we need to study logic. And so they suggest that unless you're a scientist with a PhD, you cannot comment on these things. I'm not a physician, but I know when I'm sick. I'm not a mechanic, but I know when my automobile breaks down. And I know even how to change my spark plugs. Just because we are not researched, just because we have not spent time dealing with these things, does not mean automatically that we cannot know anything about these things. And I know that Matt would not disagree with that. And I understand his point when he says you have to be well informed, but he leaves the impression that unless you have a PhD, you have no business commenting on the subject. And by the way, Matt does not have a PhD as far as I know. And yet he's telling us a lot about science, about archaeology, and about many different things. And so when we begin to consider all of this, we have to look at what is real. The Bible says that God, as He is described in Scripture, and we know that Scripture is the most decorated, the most celebrated, the most authenticated book of all human history. Again, I say to you that if we were to lay out before us all of the different artifacts that history affords us, the Holy Bible would naturally rise to the top. It has evidence upon evidence. Now, granted, it must be studied, it must be considered, it must be evaluated. We don't take it blindly. But history affords us also with those who attempted to destroy the Bible. Men who were greater than every single one of us in this room tonight. And perhaps men who had greater minds than all of our minds put together. Men like Voltaire, who said that the Bible would be destroyed in his lifetime, and yet here it is. Men like Volney, who made the same obnoxious claim, and yet here it is. Men like Thomas Paine, who was a great promoter of many of the ideals that we cherish here in this great nation of ours, who attempted to destroy the Bible, and yet here it is. And so as we look to the Bible, we see that the Bible teaches us in Psalm 119 and verse 68, God is good and doeth good. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 31, the Bible says that when God created the universe and all things therein, He surveyed His creation, and behold, all things were good. But the Bible also interjects the superlative very. And so not only were all things good, but all things were very good. And again, I have to agree with Matt. I'm a little preachy tonight. It's that Church of Christ preacher coming out in me. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 3 and 4, the Bible says, God is a just God. In Psalm 89 and verse 14, righteousness and justice are the foundation of His throne. In 2 Samuel chapter 22 and verse 31, the claim is God is perfect. In James chapter 1 and verse 17, entering into the New Testament, every good gift and every perfect gift comes from God. And that has reference to the actual giving and the actual object that is considered good. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 58, the audacious claim is God is perfect. And therefore, without mistake, the Bible describes a God who is good. And therefore, we come to the conclusion, utilizing our minds properly, understanding that we must interpret these scriptures properly, that indeed God is the radex of morality. He is the very source of morality. Remember, I made mention of chronology last night. And there is a secular chronology, the study of time, and there is a biblical chronology. Secularly, we can only go back as far back as 3,500 years BC. And I mentioned the Göbekli Tepe, and Matt said that was cherry picking. But it doesn't answer what we know about Göbekli Tepe and the implications of Göbekli Tepe. Now, he mentions that in passing as if he is to, like a Jedi, just wave his hand and dismiss it. When we consider these things, we're going to see that the Bible's history is accurate. And it's the only book that takes us all the way back to the beginning. And there we see a moral God creating individuals capable of morality. But because individuals have free moral agency, God then has to express to them that they function within a moral system. And this moral system is consistent with the nature of God. By the end of tonight's discussion, we'll hear something that is taken from one of Socrates' dialogues given to us by Plato called the Euthyphro dilemma. And in the Euthyphro dilemma, the question is asked, where did justice, and that translates to us, where did morality come from? And basically, is it above God? Is it beneath God? And we are forced to answer the question. If it's above God, then how can God be God? Because there's something greater than God. If it's beneath God, then morality is whatever God says it is. If He wanted us to go around eating everybody's right ear, if God commanded that, then eating right ears would be right. But there is a third option, and this is a false dichotomy, an illogical position. The third option is morality is consistent with God, because God is the very apotheosis of morality. He is the epitome of morality. He is the radex of morality. And this is why the claim from the Bible is, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." God says, look at me, understand me. I've given you an entire encyclopedia to understand who I am. And God only reveals the information that is germane to our salvation. We cannot know all there is to know about God. But what God gives us has limits, Genesis to Revelation. And everything in between is designed to help us to understand something about whom? God. Why? Because God is the radex of morality. And because He wanted us to see how He would do it, He sent Jesus. In John chapter 1 and verse 1, the Bible says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." In verse 14, the Word took on flesh and made His dwelling among us. This is how God would have done it. If you want to know and you want to see God in action, look to Jesus. That's why He is the perfect copula between man and God, because Jesus is the perfect God-man. He is God and He is man, and therefore, as He enters into the physical world, leaving the spiritual world, He then serves as that bridge, that copula between man and God. Jesus declared, "I am the way, I am the life, and I am the truth." But in John chapter 12 and verse 48 through 50, there the Bible is careful to tell us that Jesus did not speak anything of His own will. He only relayed what God had deposited to Him. When Jesus' mission was finished, He sent the Holy Spirit. The Spirit is referred to in John chapter 16 as the Spirit of truth. And so you can see that God the Father's truth given to Jesus as He is truth. In John chapter 1 and verse 18, Jesus is described as the exegesis of God. In John chapter 16 verse 13, there the Bible tells us the mission of the Spirit. And guess what? The Spirit did not speak of His own accord. He only spoke those things that were given to Him. And so God at all times was in control. Jesus came to show us how to do it. The Holy Spirit came to give us complete revelation so that we could understand not only how to do it, but why we must do it. Now, when we understand the development of morality, we see that we have a picture of how we enter into this world. Romans chapter 9 and verse 11 says that we begin in our mother's womb. And in our mother's womb, we have done neither good or bad, the Bible says. In Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 39, just outside the womb, the word there for child is toddler, around 3 to 5 years of age. And the Bible says they have no knowledge of good and evil. In Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 16, the Bible says, now as the word child is used in the form of an adolescent, the Bible says before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, thus and so. And so as we take a stand back, we look at the scriptures, we understand that in Romans 9:11, in the womb they have done neither good or evil. Just outside the womb, they have no knowledge of good and evil. Deuteronomy 1:39. And in Isaiah 7:16, there is an age where they can be taught now to refuse the evil and to choose the good. And so in that moral development, physically, you see how the capacity to distinguish between good and evil develops. And we don't deny the empirical evidence that substantiates that. Now, as we enter into the mind and how the mind must make sense of life, we do not disagree that you can be good without God. In Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, there the Bible says that by our own human nature, we can understand good apart from any knowledge of God. But eventually, as we begin to understand what God ultimately reveals to us through His creation, through nature, as we begin to reason and we begin to understand, the good that we come to naturally forces us to understand that there is something greater than ourselves. Because we cannot explain the goodness that is within ourselves that we naturally come to terms with without that being the case. And when we look at the Bible, we see that although it's possible to understand good in a natural sense, it is impossible to refine that good to a point where it is beneficial to you and me. Beyond the simplistic benefits of understanding good as Matt has displayed them, general principles, he says. We choose health over sickness. We choose well-being over not being well. Those are very simplistic concepts of morality. But when you look at the finer points, he talks about one who breaks a window to enter in to use a defibrillator. God would not be against that. We talked about extenuating circumstances last night. Break the window. Get in there and save yourself. But understand, you are responsible to pay for that window, and you are responsible to pay for the defibrillator and to make sure that you cover all expenses. But God's not going to fault you for that. There's no situational ethics as Matt was describing it. There are situations and circumstances that we have to approach with a greater precision in thought, but morality is consistent all the way across. Now that sounded dangerously like moral relativism, which I know Matt does not promote. But he gets awfully close to that line. And the Bible teaches us, as we begin to look at it carefully and understand it, that in totality, a panoptic view of all that life is for the human being, the Word of God is a guide, and this guide helps us to understand and make sense of everything around us. That's my time.
Those were not the arguments you were looking for. I am a Jedi. There's a lot of ground to cover, and there's some stuff that I want to cover related to the Bible because you're going to keep going back to the Bible, and I have objections, and I think it's fair to note. Also, I'll probably talk more about it tomorrow. It's strange to me, and I don't fault Israel for this. I don't think he's misrepresenting me or intentionally trying to do so, and there's no animosity. But it's strange that I can get up here and explain that I don't think you're ignoramuses, and yet they think we're literalists, they think we're ignoramuses. No, yes, I can tell when my car's not working. But if a mechanic tells me that it's my transmission and I don't have the relevant expertise, I look ridiculous standing there stamping my feet, saying, no, you're wrong, it can't be the transmission. I just changed the fluid. I'm not saying in any way that people can't comment in an area, even if they have no expertise. That's how you learn. by allowing yourself to be corrected, by seeking information. Of course I'm going to comment on things. Everybody should. The question is, if somebody raises a subject and they have spent years studying this and are decorated with the degrees that come along with it, which is, by the way, built on the knowledge of the people who went before them, the people who went before them, and we have learned more and we've gotten better, and they explain something to you, and you admit that you do not comprehend it, you cannot then declare that this is false. You can say you don't believe it. You can say you're unconvinced. You can maybe seek for more information. I disagree with Israel about secular chronology. I think it goes back 13.7 billion years, because that's the age of the universe according to secular science, which is the only science. My accusation about cherry picking wasn't that you were picking anything particular about Göbekli Tepe. Man, it's a hard thing to say. That place that we found. It was about the dating methods that are used to date that are the same dating methods that are objected to by young earth creationists. That is the cherry picking I'm talking about. Being okay with the dating methods when they fit what you would like it to be, and objecting to it when it contradicts the Bible. Which, by the way, one of the comments we heard today was, if science doesn't lead to God, then I have no use for it. I cannot live that way. Now, I'd written down Euthyphro dilemma because you kind of touched on it. The Euthyphro dilemma, commonly phrased, is something moral or virtuous because the gods, in this case God, says so, or does God say so because it's morally virtuous? Is God the person who tells us about what morality actually already is, or is morality what God dictates? Divine command theory, which I have no idea. I don't know if you accept divine command theory, that God could say tomorrow that rape is morally good and it becomes so, but I find that preposterous. I think it makes morality meaningless. But if the latter is true, that God is telling us about morality that exists, and I don't see this as a false dilemma, because I have no problem with the idea that God could tell us about morality that is consistent with his nature. These two prongs are consistent. Then there's no reason to think that we couldn't discover those truths about morality without having the messenger give them to us. And in fact, that's what we all, seemingly, based on Gabriel's conversation and the idea that we can be good without God, we agree on. And that's one point that I'd like to make. If we can agree that I can be good without God, that I can come to correct moral conclusions, that's good enough. What's morality for, then? If I can come to correct moral conclusions, what do I need the God for? And if it's because this is about getting to an afterlife, if it's because that's the ultimate goal, then the morality of this world is irrelevant in every sense, except, if you have to actually be saved to be baptized, is baptism a moral requirement? I guess you guys might consider that it's a moral obligation. I don't see that that's the case. I'm going to touch on the Bible a little bit, and I'll get back to the good without God and good enough thing. One of my biggest objections to the Bible is it clearly advocates slavery. And we heard about that today. And I talked to Brother Sam after, it was Sam, right? Yeah, after he spoke. 5 minutes. I talked to him after he spoke, and because we had some disagreements, because what I saw was a complete sugarcoating of what the Bible has to say about slavery. Sam pointed out that, hey, you got to let your slaves go after 7 years, and your slave can say, I love you, and I love my master, and I want to be with him, and, voluntary slavery, and that he thinks that God was dealing with slavery in the context in order to eventually abolish slavery. Well, not all of that is exactly honest, because you don't let your slaves go in the 7th year. You let Hebrew slaves go in the 7th year. The slaves that you buy from the heathens around you are yours as property that you can pass on to your children, and they are yours forever. And this idea that a slave could say, I love my master, well, let's read that a little bit carefully. This applies to Hebrew slaves that you would have had to let go in the 7th year, but if you've given them a wife and children, they have to go and leave their wife and children behind. Who wants to do that? It is, by my evaluation, a clear demonstration of how you trick your fellow Hebrews into becoming your slaves forever, because you give them a wife and you buy a single Hebrew slave, you give him a wife and kids, and when the 7 years is gone, he has an obligation, I would say a moral obligation, to stay there with his family. And so what is he required to do? He's required to go before the town elders and say, I love my master. They drive an awl through the ear, piercing the ear. It's not a big deal. It's not like beating him. And he's their slave forever. Oh, and by the way, you can beat your slaves as long as they don't die within a day or two. God couldn't, the explanation that we heard today was that God needed to do this and work in this context so eventually we could abolish slavery. No. If he's God and he can declare thou shalt not kill, then he can declare thou shalt not own another person as property ever. And nobody could say a word against it. It is the most ridiculous apologetic to say that God simply couldn't tell us slavery was wrong. The slaves knew slavery was wrong. We know it's wrong. This is a simple thing. Yet it is the biggest sticking point, one of the biggest sticking points, along with having rape victims marry their rapist, which I don't think elevates women at all. I think it is one of the most brutal and cruel things you could do to someone who suffered a tragedy of that type, is to tell them, oh, and now you're going to have to marry him. And there's a countless array of morally questionable things for which the apologetics just simply aren't convincing. And while it may be the case that we can't have goodness if there isn't a God, the God of the Bible does not represent the goodness that I see and the goodness that I advocate. The consideration there isn't about humankind. It isn't about our well-being. Our well-being is not even necessarily a consideration, because this is all God's plan and this is all God's rule. And I don't buy it.
Well, Matt says that the universe is 13.7 billion years old. He is incorrect. With the new photograph, the new data that I mentioned the first night of the cosmic microwave background, they've actually adjusted that figure. Go home and look at this. It's now 13.82 billion years old. And so we talk about the precision of science, and then as an argument of convenience, we say, well, science is a joy because it helps us to correct ourselves. It's self-correcting. It's a self-correcting method, and therefore it is a superior method. And while that is true in some areas, it is not true in other areas. Without consistency, without absolutes, without standards, then we can never make sense of anything. Consider the standard of measurement that we use here in the States. If we did not all agree to a standard of measurement, then there's no way we could ever go to Home Depot and buy a 5x8. You would say, give me a piece of wood. Well, what size do you want? I don't know, just give me a piece of wood. We have to have a standard by which to measure things that is common to all people so that we can begin to make progress in certain areas. Now, he said something about being a Jedi, but we have to ask the question, what kind of Jedi? Because there were dark Jedis and there were good Jedis. And that's the question tonight with regard to morality. Is he a dark Jedi, or is he a Jedi that represents light? Now, with regard to the statement that he made concerning good, that if we can be good without God, that's enough. No, it isn't. Because good and learning good is only one piece of the puzzle. And if he was listening carefully in my introductory presentation, it is possible to be good without God, but it's not possible to refine that goodness so that we can benefit from it the way God intended for us to benefit from it. And good is only a means to an end. Because if he agrees that we can be good, the question is, why be good? What does goodness imply? And this takes us to the other question, that the position which Matt has been upholding these last few days, and those associated with him who hold a very similar position, this is the other side of the question that they cannot answer. They cannot answer about origin, and they certainly cannot answer about destiny. And so we're no better than the dog. When we're dead all over like Rover. And life just comes to a screeching halt. All we are is organized matter. And because we've been organized in such a way, consciousness somehow just came about. From rocks and dirts, water and gases if you'd like, we get consciousness, and that consciousness, as it's shaped and refined over generations, we develop these very elaborate systems of thinking that we are asked to put our trust in. But when you think about the Big Bang model, the evolutionary model, how can we put our trust in something that is still evolving? It doesn't make sense. And so it's not enough just to know that you can be good, because you still have to answer the question, why be good? And what does goodness drive me toward? Is there anything after? Now, with regard to slavery, he says the Bible does not say, thou shalt not own. As a matter of fact, it has that thrust in Scripture. And it's interesting because Matt would like to use this, and he likes to pinpoint certain verses and exploit them for their presupposed weaknesses. But in Exodus 21:16, notice how it reads. And I'm going to read this so you can see me reading it, and then we will discuss it. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. God is against slavery, at least the slavery that Matt is talking about. Stealing someone and then selling him for advantage or gain. In the midst of the entire discussion concerning slavery in Exodus 21, and he was mostly accurate in those things that he's given, but he doesn't tell you the context. And he only exploits certain areas. It's an emotional appeal. It's an emotional attack against our senses and what we know, and we're shocked. God was for slavery? We have to understand everything that the Bible says and then come to a conclusion with calmness and poise. In verse 16, how would he harmonize verse 16 with everything else in Exodus? Don't steal a person, don't sell a person. Jump over to the New Testament. In Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 9 and 10, notice what the Apostle Paul's sentiments. He's separated by thousands of years. Same God of the Old Testament, here in the New Testament, as Paul's inspired of the Holy Spirit and writing to the church at Ephesus, of which Timothy was the gospel teacher. In 1 Timothy 1, 9 and 10, the Bible says this, as knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and unruly, for the ungodly and sinner, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for abusers of themselves with men, for men stealers, for liars, for false swearers, and if there be any other thing contrary to the sound doctrine, according to the gospel of the glory of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust. God clearly denies and condemns slavery, at least the slavery that Matt is referring to. Go home and look up the term men stealers in this text. Study the context. We don't deny that in the New Testament you have riddled in many of its passages the word owner or master and slave. We don't deny that. There was the owner-master-slave relationship. But Matt simply has not considered everything the Bible says, because how do these two verses, one in the Old, one in the New, that clearly condemns slavery, how does this figure into the overall system? If what Matt is saying is true, if the Bible does represent God as promoting slavery, and then you have two verses like this, then that God contradicts himself. And the entire basis of the Bible, which is the argument that Matt is attempting to make, would be suspect. But there is a way to understand all of this. And we have to follow carefully all the way through. Men stealers here has reference to one who actually takes another person by force and then sells him or her for advantage or gain. Now, go to the annals of history and see what man has chronicled about slavery. There is a man by the name of Frederick Douglass in the 1800s who wrote a very perfect piece about slavery. And I forgot to bring that quote. I wanted to read it to you, but I challenge you to go and look this up. Frederick Douglass made a declaration that there were some people in his time that were using the Bible with ulterior motives to continue to promote slavery, at least the slavery that I believe Matt has in mind. And he denies it with every fiber of his being, and he was a slave. He pulled himself out of that by taking his master's books, reading them, and educating himself. He was the inspiration for so many people that trumped the very horrible slavery that we experienced here in the United States of America.
Normally I'd feel guilty about doing this, but you did it yesterday, so I will, which is I'll take a moment to reply before I ask a question. Man stealing, you keep talking about the slavery that I'm objecting to. The slavery that I'm objecting to is owning another person as property. Man stealing is an admonition about stealing somebody else's slaves or going in and grabbing somebody and stealing them and selling them. It's a different issue from slavery, the owning of property itself. In Leviticus 25, beginning at verse 44, and as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as possessions, that they shall be your permanent slaves. The idea that we need to tap dance around and say the Bible is against slavery because it's against man stealing and selling, and every time it talks about that, it's about man stealing and selling, man stealing, does not mean the Bible's against slavery. And the other apologetic I've heard is that in Philemon, Paul asked for the release of a slave. That's not the Bible saying anything about slavery. That's about an individual requesting another slave be stolen. If a simple plain reading of this isn't enough and you have to tap dance around, my question that I asked, which I'll ask you now, still stands. Why is it that the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe, in the process of conveying what he wants and what he considers to be moral, wrote down that you can own people as property instead of saying that you should not if it is immoral to own someone as property?
Matt believes he has something with this, and it's nothing. Not the nothing that Lawrence Krauss describes. I'm talking about literal nothing.
Cool.
Nothing here was said about Exodus 21:16, where God clearly says you cannot go and accost someone, take them, and then sell them. In 1 Timothy 1:9, he attempted to define the word, but he didn't develop the context. He didn't tell us why Paul wrote to Timothy. He didn't tell us what the conditions were there and how all of this figures in. There is clearly a contrast between what everything God says in the Old Testament with verse 16 of Exodus chapter 21. And there's clearly a contrast in everything the New Testament says with 1 Timothy 1:9. Now, what's amazing to me is that Matt has not realized that today in the United States of America, we still practice slavery, at least in the definition that he has presented forth, as I am assuming his definition from the context of his speech. What do we do with people who violate laws on a consistent basis? Every man is innocent until proven guilty, but once he is proven guilty, what do we do with these people? We incarcerate them. We strip them from their freedom. And then in prison, what do we do with them? We send them out here to pick up trash. Do they have a choice? They most certainly do not. And if they choose to rebel and backmouth those who are in control and even rise up to rebel, the authority that the government gives these individuals, and that authority ultimately comes from God. You can read the book of Romans, and it talks there about those who are in positions of authority and they do not bear the sword in vain. Those who are properly selected to control these individuals have the authority to discipline them. And sometimes the discipline has to be corporal. And so in the reference that he makes in the Old Testament about getting a stick and beating your slave, that's the context there. The context is you have someone who has been enslaved because they have violated law. They're now incarcerated and they become rebellious. God gives us the authority to discipline. Now, much has been said about the spanking of our children, and since Dr. Spock got us all crazy about the spanking of our children or the disciplining of our children, we know that the Bible in other areas also says that when we discipline our children either instructionally or corporally. It depends on the situation. Now, the Bible also says to use a stick to beat your child. But it does not say to abuse that child. And you have to understand the circumstance. You have to understand the language. Parents have the authority by Almighty God to rear their children properly. And if parents understood the kind of love, the kind of familial love, the storge love that should exist between parents and children, when they rear their children, there will be times where they have to discipline them, either in time out or in the slapping of the hand or in the putting of soap in the mouth or even in the spanking. We have all different kinds of methods and they're all debatable. What is too much and what is too less? The point is that God gives those who are in positions of authority the ability to discipline. But even those who discipline must discipline properly. God never sanctions abuse, and He never sanctioned the abuse of those that He commanded to be enslaved. We have to understand the entire situation there.
Well, I think I'd like something a little more specific than you can beat them as long as they don't die within 2 or 3 days. I don't know prisoners. I don't know how we got to prisoners. They're not property. They're wards of the state. And by the way, you can be released from prison, among many other things. And there are limitations in laws. And I don't know how we got to child beating. But my original question still stands. Why can't God simply say, "Thou shalt not own another human being as property"?
He did say that. He said it in such a way that any reasonable person can understand it. He wants to press this issue to attempt to make the appearance that I cannot answer and therefore the position that I hold is not right. But the point is, when God revealed Himself, He revealed Himself in such a way where the language itself must be understood. The context itself must be understood. God, when he revealed himself, was not under obligation to be as clear as he could be from our vantage point and from our standards. Because from God's vantage point and from his standards, he is as clear as he wanted to be, because when we understand even the nature of how God sets forth his commandments, there is still a process of testing. You remember in the New Testament when Jesus in Matthew chapter 13 was asked why he spoke to people in parables? And that was the same argument that Matt just gave. Jesus, why don't you just tell these people plainly what you want them to know? And what was Jesus' response? To whom it hath been given, he shall know. In other words, God has made it available for all people to know if they want to know. Matt is a shut down person. He is a closed-minded person. And I mean, no offense personally, but in just understanding his position and his adamancy on this point, he has not given sufficient attention to everything that is involved. The reason sometimes God speaks in parables, the reason sometimes God speaks in language that's difficult to understand, sometimes it's because he wants to understand if the person is sincere. And I've often heard that argument being a preacher for 19 years, where people say, well, if God wanted it, how come he just didn't tell me plainly? And it's always baffled me, because it depends on what you mean by plainly. God did tell us plainly. But plainly involves language. It's a complex system. There's literal language. There's figurative language. There's reasons why God gave narrative in history form. There's reasons why God gave poetry. There's reasons why God gave all different types of genre. And you can extrapolate a principle from Deuteronomy chapter 8, when there the Bible teaches that there were times where God purposely chose difficult ways in order to test his people. You remember there when God had liberated the people of Israel, and he took them through a difficult way. He said, I have done that to prove your heart, to see what lies therein.
You got 10 minutes now.
I have 10 minutes? You want to respond to that, or?
I'll take a second. So basically the position is any reasonable person could see this. God spoke as cleanly and plainly as he wanted to. Okay, cool. I don't find it plainly enough. I don't see the passage in Leviticus or in Exodus as anything remotely like a parable, especially when you're going through a bunch of thou shalts and listing rules, and you specifically advocate a position. I think interpreting that as you have to go over here to some other context to see why this was wrong, I think it makes God look foolish, but it's your time for questions.
My first question to Matt is, with regard to morality, where does morality function within the human being? What is its source? Where did it come from? The idea of morality, not the function of morality, but the idea of morality. Where did it come from? And how does it operate?
I'm not sure I understand the question, so I might have to ask a follow-up. Because my understanding, you're talking about...
Well, what is morality? What is its essence? What is its substance? And where does it exist?
Well, I don't think morality is a thing, an extant thing that exists. The source of the things that we identify, morality is our process of labeling things as good or evil, and with respect to a standard. And the standard that I was advocating wasn't, as you suggested, mere reason, but the facts, the truths about reality, that these things affect us. You know, if I slap you, it hurts. Now, there are people who don't feel pain, so those people it's not going to hurt, at least not physically. It could hurt them emotionally, which is why I would say it's probably still immoral to go ahead and slap them unless they've asked for it, which is another factor that we need to consider, which is consent. But boy, this stuff gets complicated. The source is the truth about the reality we experience. Now, you can think that there's an ultimate source beyond that, which is God, I don't see that that's the truth, and I don't see that it's necessary. And several times you've said that, we've started too late in the argument, that we can't even begin to discuss morality if we don't agree about the source of consciousness, or we can't use reason until we understand the source of reason. And I told you when you brought this up the first time that this is false. And I thought we had agreed that while it would be nice and it would be more informative if we understood the source of reason, that it's not required to know the source of reason just to know that reason is demonstrably true. I don't need to know who made my car in order for it to drive. It would be helpful for me to know that. I don't need to know who came up with this unit of measure that we agree on, whether it's arbitrary or anything else, but as long as we do agree on it, the source is irrelevant to its use. The fact that we have come up with an agreed upon standard, yards, that's a dumb standard. It doesn't seem to apply to anything. Three of somebody's feet at some point. But we can agree that this is a standard. We can measure things in yards, and now we can communicate about this. We can do the same thing with respect to reality. Can you quantify everything about human experience? Absolutely not. But we can look at the consequences of actions and say, did this improve our well-being? Did it detract from our well-being? Was it neutral? Because I think that many things are neutral. That there's not just things that we label as good or evil, but that there is a position of moral neutrality on some things. Is it immoral of me to drop this pen? No. So there's an action. It doesn't evaluate with any moral standard, or at least I would say it's not immoral. It's amoral. So with regard to where it comes from, the standard that I'm advocating for is reality, primarily because I don't see that I can go further than reality, nor do I see that I need to go further than reality. And the reason I said that good without God is good enough is because part of this seems a little silly to me. You and I agree, for example, that slavery is immoral. Neither one of us would advocate owning another person as property. I'm guessing, you're nodding.
That's true.
And as long as we agree, it would be nice if we knew more, and it might benefit us to discuss it and find out more. And I think it's necessary that we look back to see why that is so that we understand how to apply those principles in other places. But we don't necessarily need to know the why to know that it is. And the thing that you represented earlier is that if I can't know this origin, then I can't know anything. And that's simply false. If you don't know the origin, you don't know the origin. That doesn't mean that you don't know anything and that you can't prove anything and that you can't reason about anything or that you can't understand moral situations. The fact that we don't have a moral answer to every situation and never will doesn't mean that we don't know anything about morality. Because with these Matt just gave very simple foundational principles of, life is, yes, because I was trying to illustrate how you can begin with those and build a more complex system, which is, by the way, what I am convinced we have done. We've begun with these simple things, and as we learned more about this, hey, we tried this out. It didn't work. It worked to our detriment. This worked to our betterment. And so we are going to stick with these things that work to our betterment. But this person doesn't agree because this worked out different from them. This is the process by which we construct the complex moral views that we have now. It's why thou shalt not kill in and of itself, and I know that we don't have to take it in and of itself, is limited. And the legal code about murder and manslaughter and accidental homicide and whatever else there is amongst all those is so much more broad because we've learned more since then. But in every case, we're appealing to reality, the real effects on us. And I don't know why we need to go further.
You said a lot there, more
Yes,
than what I asked. So I want to just answer a few things and then segue into my next question. Is that okay?
Yeah, fine.
The reason I said that without getting the metaphysical aspect correct, and therefore you can't get anything else correct, is because the metaphysical aspect is the first in the step of us making sense of ourselves. If we cannot answer the origin, then we're merely guessing in our epistemology. We're merely guessing in our logic. We're merely guessing in our ethics, and we're merely guessing in our aesthetics. This is the reason why when you think about this calmly and rationally, you're going to see that the reason we're so adamant that God must be there is because he is a logical necessity. And he made mention about reason and how he says we don't just base morality on reason. We look at the facts. We look at the evidence. Facts and evidence go back to reason. Fact and evidence must be evaluated by reason. Facts and evidence, either whether it be evidence that you observe as beneficial or not, it still must be evaluated by reason. The scientific method, how did it come about? Did a rock whisper to us, "Psst, hey buddy, this is the way we should begin to evaluate things"? No. The scientific method was developed over a long period of time of people thinking. And through observation and experimentation, they said this makes the most sense and it's consistent with what will lead us to truth. We do not go against science, although there were a lot of statements made, and I wanted to make this point too about the various preachers that were preaching. We understand that we're susceptible to making mistakes. We would be fools to say that we never misspeak, that we always make claims that are precise and 100% accurate. But that does not negate the fact that all that we're talking about, when considered properly, comes to the conclusion that there is a God. Now, if someone said that, or if they alluded to making the statement, we don't need science, that was a false statement, because science ultimately comes from God. Science does no violence to the religious position. And when we begin to think about these things, we look at them and we understand them and we begin to make sense of ourselves and the universe in which we live. I want to segue into my second question. Morality in the Bible is looking forward to man's destiny. Morality is inextricably tied with a judgment. The Bible says that all men will be judged either by the good or the evil that they've committed in the body. And in Genesis 18, there the Bible says that God is the judge of all the earth and he does what's right. And so from your position, does morality have any bearing on human destiny?
7 seconds.
I don't know. That seems to be the. Can I just answer this?
Go ahead.
That seems to be the answer that everybody hates, and yet I think it's obviously the best answer in many situations. Depends on what you mean by destiny. If you're talking about destiny as far as the ultimate judgment that you refer to, then no, because I don't think that that's anything that's going to happen. I don't have any good reason to think that's going to happen. When you talk about whether or not morality plays into our destiny as far as the future of human beings, then yes, obviously, this is about us. This is about who we are. This idea, by the way, that we can't reason correctly if we don't first know metaphysics, the origin, then we're stuck, because you have to use reasoning to determine the metaphysics and origin. And instead, I go back to the logical absolutes of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, which are demonstrably absolute, and they are true. And even if we don't know why they are true, and the demonstration of this is the same as it is to demonstrate that this pen works. You pick it up and you use it, and you evaluate the results from it. And reason works. We know this, which is why we use it. Pain. Oh, okay, there's this idea about morality. Sure. If I don't know ultimately where morals come from, how can I say that slavery is wrong? And if it's my objection is based on pain, then what? Well, it's not, so I guess we can...
How do you determine with precision that the type of slavery in the Bible is immoral if you don't know where morality came from? And if you say that that is based upon pain, then is incarcerating criminals immoral?
Okay. How do I determine that the slavery in the Bible was wrong if I don't know where morality comes from? And if it's based on pain, how is incarcerating prisoners immoral? Well, I didn't say I don't know where morality comes from. The morality that I'm talking about is directly related to well-being and to the facts about reality. And so the reason that I say that owning another person as property, the particular thing in the Bible that I'm objecting to, is wrong, is because we can demonstrate that this is not only not in the well-being of the individual, ultimately, but it's not even in the well-being of the slave owners in society. We have this idea, owning slaves is great for the slave owners. And as it turns out, as we've learned after a long period of time, that it's actually not. For the same reason that slaughtering the people who are not like you is not good for you, because you don't know what those people would have produced had they lived. And you also set up a society where people are unequal, where there is a denial of dignity and autonomy. And this idea of a veil of ignorance when you're going to try to determine. One of the things I ask myself when it comes to morality is, if everybody in the world did this, would we be better off or worse off? And when it comes to slavery, if everybody in the world kept slaves, well, then anybody can be a slave. And if you set up a system where slavery is allowed, how do you know you're not going to be the slave, that you're not going to be the one benefiting from this? And so what we find is that the society that has slaves actually declines, because they stick with this really simplistic agrarian model. There's no motivation for progress, and the dignity of these individuals of potentially having to constantly fight for their freedom, which they value and the slave owners value, is counterproductive. It's an appeal to the actual consequences that shows that this isn't in our well-being. With regard to incarcerating prisoners, this is a necessity currently until we find some better way of dealing with disruptive elements in society. See, the thing about morality is it's about human interactions. We are social creatures. We are stuck interacting. And morality is all about our interactions. If I was the only being in the universe, there is no morality. There's no interactions to do. I can't wrong anybody else. And wronging myself is something that I should be able to do. I don't even know how you could call it wrong. But we have to make attempts to maintain order in society. We have to make attempts to impose rules in society. And those people did I lose my mic? Those people who, for whatever reason, aren't going to adhere to those ideas, we have to do something. We've tried exile. Australia's doing much better now, I'm happy to say. We have tried incarceration. We have tried various forms of punishment. Maybe someday we'll ship them off the world. I would prefer that in the future, incarceration and many other penalties, many other ways of dealing with criminal acts, go away. That we may find out more about the human mind, how it works, about the social influences that lead people to certain things, or even sometimes the psychochemical influences that lead people to these things, and find a better way to treat them, treat it through education, perhaps through medication, other things where we don't necessarily have to deny someone their freedom. But a necessary evil, as a matter of practicality in the world, is something that we can recognize. Owning another person as property is not a necessary evil, as far as I can see.
Okay, the question is that I made the statement earlier that Matt was playing our emotions when he made his appeal to slavery, but I did not give what slavery is and how it's explained in the Bible. I don't remember the exact wording, but I think that's the gist of it. I agree with Matt on the definition of slavery, owning someone. And so the reason I didn't go in to explain that it was a different slavery, because it wasn't. The slavery that he's talking about is one person owning another person. But what I did point out was within the Old Testament, there are different contexts in which a slave was owned. There was a situation that was equated to a debt. There was a situation where foreigners were taken in. There was a situation where criminals were enslaved. And so from that I extrapolated only one general idea, and that is the incarceration idea that we've been discussing now. But here's the point with regard to all of this. It goes back to one's hermeneutic and exegesis. Hermeneutics is the science and art of interpretation. Exegesis is the application of our hermeneutic. Now, we don't fear the difficult parts of the Bible because the Bible itself tells you there are some difficult parts of it. In the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 29:29, if you look at the context of Deuteronomy 29, there God is giving punishment to his people, and he also contrasts that with reward in other passages. But just before he says that we have been given God's law, that we may learn it and do it and teach our children, he says the secret things belong to God. There, if you look at that phrase, the secret things belong to God, Moses there is making reference to, inspired of God, that when God makes a statement of fact and does not reveal the process, that sometimes God chooses not to reveal that process for whatever reason, but we understand that God is still behind it, he's still in control, and so there's other areas that help us to understand what God is doing here. And so with regard to slavery, if we look at slavery just with blinders on, and we don't consider the entire context of the Bible, for example, where the Bible says that God is good, where the Bible says that God doeth good, where the Bible says that God is just, where the Bible says so forth and so on, that he's right. Now, if we accept the Bible, we accept all of it. Now, if one portion of the Bible says he's good, just, and right, and then over here we have a discussion of slavery, then there is either a contradiction or there is a misinterpretation. So when we look at it, we will be able to reveal that. And I was warning against an appeal to emotion because in my knowledge of discussions such as these, or debates, or whatever you want to call it, there are tactics that are used. And I'm not necessarily accusing Matt of using a tactic because he could get up and say the same thing about me. Well, Israel may be using a tactic.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's necessary for us to understand that there are some things that are shocking in the Bible. They're shocking. But just because they're shocking doesn't automatically mean that they're wrong, that God is atrocious, that he's immoral, that he's a monster. These are things that we have to go beyond and look at this with calm and poise and consider everything the Bible says before we arrive at a conclusion.
Can I jump in for just 1 second, because I think we're in agreement. Is that right? Yeah. I didn't, when he said that I was appealing to emotion, I did not think that he was accusing me of a fallacious appeal to emotion, and I respect Israel enough, and he's obviously smart enough that I wouldn't have suspected that was the case. For those who don't know the difference, there is a logical fallacy that is appeal to emotion, and it's tied with appeal to consequences, which is one of the objections I have to versions of the moral argument. But the mere fact that an argument includes a premise or an idea that prompts emotion doesn't in any way make it fallacious, because we are emotional beings, we're passionate about everything, and I can make a logical argument about how curling is the best sport ever, and for the people who have an emotional impact on curling, there's going to be some emotion there, and it is, except for billiards.
And then also you have questions like, have you stopped beating your wife?
Yes.
And, when you pose a question like that, it has a shock factor. And, you're taken back first. Wait a minute, did I stop? If you say, yes, I've stopped beating my wife, you leave the implication that you used to beat her. Yeah. If you say no, then obviously you've incriminated yourself, you're still beating her. And so it puts you into a little dilemma. The shock, the emotional factor twists you up a little bit. But when you calmly and rationally think about it, I have never beat my wife, and nor am I now beating my wife, is the correct answer to that question.
And if only God would be that clear. Yeah, so to restate the question, what evidence do I have that human morality is greater today than it was in our ancestors' time, given that we still have wars and other things? Steven Pinker's written a really good book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which actually compiles a lot of statistics to show that the world is, despite claims to the contrary, becoming a better place in almost every regard. I'm not proclaiming that we've solved every moral issue or that we are perfect or anything else. I think one of the problems that kind of makes this difficult to see is that while we have gotten a better understanding about morality, we've also gotten better at war. And so, and yet we've gotten worse at war too. I mean, how long have these recent things taken compared, to, World War I, et cetera, and the amount of resources that we put into it? But going back, back when you had to face someone across a field and potentially stab them, I think that has more of an impact, and I think we've shown it has more of an impact on the actual individual than it does pushing a button or driving a tank and playing a video game. Basically, our wars are becoming more and more like video games. But there's a lot more to this than war, because war doesn't tell us whether or not we have a better understanding of morality. It tells us whether or not we're actually any better at enacting and adhering to those standards. And on many occasions, as unfortunate as is, I mean, I'm not a pacifist or anything else. Of course, like everybody else, I'd love to see all wars end. But I recognize that sometimes it's an inevitability. It's like self-defense. If I kill someone in self-defense, have I committed murder? Not by any standard. I don't even think by any sort of biblical standard. So in addition to Steven Pinker's book, the evidence that I have, what I see, is that we're not just getting better at morality. We're getting better at everything. The more we understand about who we are and how we work together, and the better we improve our societies, that is also contributes to morality. Because when I talk about well-being, it's not just physical health, it's mental health, it's societal health, and all these interactions. And there's another interesting study, which I feel guilty about raising, which from the Journal of Religious Education Studies, it's several years old, that maps for different countries factors of societal health compared to religiosity. And I'm bringing this up to kind of disabuse some of my atheist friends from using it this way. It's often used because, as we find out, those societies that are most religious have the lowest ratings on social health, and those societies which are the least religious have the highest ratings on societal health, with a couple of outliers, but it's a pretty good chart. And some people have used this to demonstrate a causality, which I am adamantly opposed to. It doesn't mean that religion causes damage to society, but what it does demonstrate is that there's no good reason to think that religion helps prevent a decrease in society, or that necessarily better society. I think there are religious ideas that can better society, and I think there are secular ideas that can improve society. Apart from Pinker's book and evidence like that, I don't know what else to point you to other than, and this is kind of dishonest, it seems intuitively obvious to me that we must be better at this, that I have a better understanding of morality than my 7th great-grandfather did, just by the fact that I am exposed to so much more information about the world and able to process more and able to benefit from the knowledge of those who came before me.
When we look at the history of mankind, we see something beautiful unveiling with regard to the question that you asked. And let me restate it for the sake of those viewing via the internet. The question was asked, we have a lady here who is from the eastern side of the world, and she's asking, and she stated that there are over 10,000 different gods, and there's some cultures that believe in gods, others that don't believe in gods, and that in Eastern cultures you have Taoism, you have Confucianism, Buddhism, and the question ultimately ends up in, how do you know that the God that you uphold is superior, morally superior? Because those other religions also have morals, and these religions or ideas, many of them were before the Bible. Did I represent you right? Okay.
Yes, the people that doesn't have a religion also do have morals in the society.
Okay, the people who don't have a religion also have morals in society. So when we look at the history of mankind, how it developed, you're going to see something beautiful unfolding. As far back as we can go with human records, we find that people were worshiping some superhuman controlling power. Others chose not to. But the great majority is that peoples of all times worship some superhuman controlling power. And this was one of the primary arguments I made in the second night of our discussion, and that is because God in history, and I go back all the way to the origin, we have to understand that the origin is where everything begins. If we don't begin right, we are not promised to end right. If we start somewhere in the middle, we're merely guessing, and we make our best guesses in order to end right. But as I look at the Bible, I see the God of the Bible who creates the universe, all things therein. He creates humanity. Humanity then rebels against him, and this is where you have false gods being created through the imagination of man, taking the original concept of God and rebelling against him. They create these false gods. That was the premise of my argument. And so as we look at history, we begin to see how polytheism began to rise up. And what's interesting is when you look at history and you look at the ancient Near East, where the children of Israel arose from ancient Mesopotamia in the Fertile Crescent, you're going to see that they arose in a time where there were multiple gods already a part of human culture. If you do your study, you can go back to the 4th and 5th centuries, and almost simultaneously across the world, you have different systems arising. In what we at that time called the Americas, even before it was discovered, you had the Native Americans, and they had a system of spirituality or religion, and it was called animism. They worship primarily animals, and they also worship the sun, the moon, the stars, and various things of this nature. You come over to the ancient Near East, and you have, of course, Judaism, and you have also polytheism associated with the Egyptians, other ancient civilizations, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. You go to the east and you have Kung Fu Zhu, who is the one that gave us Confucianism. You have Lao Tzu, who gave us Taoism. And then over history, you have some of those ideas being mixed that gave us Zen Buddhism. You have Gautama of the tribe, or he's the Siddhartha of the tribe of Gautama that gave us the Buddha, the enlightened one. And so simultaneously across the world, you have different people popping up with different ideas. And as far as we can tell, according to the data, and even as it is supported in the Bible, you have different people inventing different systems of morality and different systems of morality attributed to different gods. And so throughout this evening, I made the statement, it's possible to be good without God. And so those cultures that you make reference to in those parts of the world that don't believe in a God or in the God of the Bible, I fully agree they can have a moral system. But where did that moral system come from beyond their just natural ability to reason in those very basic things that help us to differentiate between health and what is not health, or well-being and what is not well-being? And if they have a moral system, that directly implies that they must believe something about destiny. Otherwise, why be good? Why be good? Why even have a term that you label action as good if there is nothing beneficial about that label? And so as you begin to think about these things, it's possible for human beings to develop a moral system. That's completely possible. And after God injected himself, the idea of God, it's fully possible for individuals to invent different gods. But that does not negate the fact that in all of the different manuscripts and all of the different artifacts and all of the different archaeological discoveries, there is one book that is superior to the annals of Confucianism. There is one book that is superior to those things that were written by Lao Tzu. There is one book superior than the system that was developed by the Buddha. There is one book that is superior even to those things that we know about animism. And it boils down to the evidence that we have to support this book. Now, if we were to compare the Bible to Confucius's annals, to Lao Tzu's writings, and the five books of the rings, or the five rings of the book, I can't remember exactly how that goes, the I Ching, and then you have also the very systematic teachings of the Buddha and Hinduism and all of these different things, Zen Buddhism, animism. If we were to lay all of that on a table and compare it reasonably and rationally, the Bible has more evidence than all of those books, and in some cases, all of those books combined. The Bible has over 6,000 or just under 6,000 different manuscripts in museums all over the world, from the Oriental Museum in Chicago all the way to the museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. And we can investigate these things and we can learn about these things. Just recently, a man discovered Dr. Ivan Finkel, or Finke, I believe it is. He's the curator for the British Museum, and he recently discovered a clay tablet. And it's a very small clay tablet. It has cuneiform on it. He's an expert in this. And as he deciphered this clay tablet, he discovered a story that was very similar to the story of the flood of the Bible and Noah. Now, he, of course, does not support the position of religion. It's clear in his interview, and I challenge you to go to CNN. You can read about this. Dr. Ivan Finkel. I know I'm getting his name wrong there, but you can search this out. But what's interesting about this clay tablet and his interpretation of the cuneiform there is it tells the story in such great detail, and it uses the peculiar phrase 2 by 2. Now, when you begin to look at this and you compare it to what the Bible says, obviously you begin to see how these things formulated. If nothing, this is evidence that at least helps us to understand that there was already a great event that was being talked about, and we have to explain how that peculiar phrase 2 by 2 in reference to the animals was utilized. But what's more surprising than this is that this archaeologist said that we have in our possession right now in the British Museum over 130,000 different clay tablets that we have not even begun to interpret or work on. And he says the reason we don't have people working on that is because we don't have experts in these areas. There are very few of us. And it would take literally 500 years for each person to sit down and do justice to those clay tablets. Who knows but that in the future we'll have more evidence that supports the Bible. And this is why we wait patiently and we see the evidence compiling that continues to support the superiority of the Bible over these other writings. And we don't deny that there are some good things there. They come from men with great minds. I don't deny that Confucius was a great man. His philosophy was that we are to treat people with respect, that we are to love one another essentially. But his mind that was given to him by God, at least from my perspective, has the power to understand that. But just because he thought that and wrote that, at the same time that the people of God were traveling in a different part of the world, doesn't mean that there is no God. And when I look at the Bible, it helps me to understand something about religion and these thoughts. And when we think about it in terms of superiority, inferiority is not the implication. Oftentimes, this is a loaded question sometimes. It's like the same question, have you stopped beating your wife? Because if I say the Bible is superior, then I automatically condemn all of the Eastern people. And this, in some ways, in some people's minds, paints me as a monster, and how arrogant of you to say that. But we remove all the emotional components. We look at things rationally, and then we come to a conclusion regardless of its implications.
Well, I got to get in,
All right, go ahead.
and I will be shorter. I've heard you ask twice now, why be good, even after I answered this in my opening. And you said, why be good if there's nothing beneficial about the term? There is something beneficial about the term, which is why we call it good. We don't need a God to be able to, you can be good without God, but you can't have good without God. Yes, you absolutely can. All you need to do is be able to compare things. If this thing is better than this one, then this is the one you label good. That's all you need for this. And it's the demonstration of this. The Bible is better than this book. The Bible is better than this book. The Bible is better than this book. You're doing the comparison. It's a useless statistic, like the fact that it's the most authorized, that it's better than this. The question isn't is it better than this? Is it good enough? Is the Bible's better than this? The Bible is better than this. I can write a book of moral instructions that is better than the Bible, and I can prove this to everybody right now. Because I could rewrite the Bible word for word, excise the passages that say you can own somebody as property, and insert a clear statement that you cannot own people as property, and it would then be better. That's all you need. Better is the process of comparing these things. And I could probably write one better other than just the copying thing, but that was the quick example.
I don't believe it.
Oh, so okay, she's a scientist in behavioral studies, and in the process of doing studies, you have to consider the ethical impact of things. And so your question is, there are questions about the authenticity of the Bible. There are things that I'm challenging. Given that there are also true things, is what I'm doing ethical?
Right, what you're promoting.
Absolutely, what I'm doing is ethical, because I'm not denying that there are true things in the Bible. I'm pointing out the things that I object to, honestly. I'm pointing out which things I think we can disprove, if any. I'm pointing out which things I think have not had sufficient evidence to establish them. I don't see how there's anything unethical about giving your honest assessment of something and explaining why you do or don't accept it. Now, I think, and I don't mean to be presumptive, but I think the question that you're getting at is, I seem to have, and have at times claimed to have, the desire to rid the world of religious belief and superstition, and given that I don't know for sure that it's false, is it unethical for me to do that? Is that closer to kind of where you were leading?
Right.
Okay. Then I love that question. I love it both ways, because it's about an honest thing. So another way we hear about this type of question is, there are some people who seem to need religion in order to be good. I mean, that they can't seem to do this. And the people who were telling me that they'd rape and kill people, is it ethical of me to convince them that there is no religion, thus setting a raving murderer out on the streets? And my answer to that is, I'll keep it short because it's kind of complicated. Yes. In much the same way that the truth is always a defense, I'm not asserting that something is necessarily false. I'm not claiming that there is no supernatural. I'm not claiming that there is no God. I'm not claiming that this religion is wrong. I am demonstrating why I don't agree with it and compelling others who have similar doubts to evaluate this. And if they come to the same conclusion, I have not stolen hope from them. I have not stolen their future from them. I have convinced them to give it up for the same reasons, hopefully, that I have. One thing that I don't want, which is what we railed against yesterday, is anybody to give up their religion by force. I would never advocate any sort of let's make religion illegal thing, but also for garbage reasons. There was a film that was referenced yesterday called Zeitgeist, which is this astro-mythicist. Jesus is a fictional copy of all these other gods that came before, and it has probably created a whole bunch of atheists who don't know the first thing about any of this. My primary goal is I want to believe as many true things and as few false things, and I'd like to convince other people to follow that same path. We can have disagreements, we can reach different conclusions, we can do these debates, and if I convince someone, I don't find it to be unethical at all, because it's all done in the vein of sincere honesty. I am not intending to deceive, nor am I doing anything, nor am I lying about this. You know, when I object to citations about the number of manuscripts, and I point out that he seems to overlook that some of them are the size of a credit card and we still don't have autographs in there, that this subject of whether or not the Bible is a much bigger one than he's done, although he hasn't had the time. This is not fair to him that we didn't have a discussion on the authenticity of the Bible. I'm not lying. We have a disagreement about what the scripture actually says about slavery, but I'm not lying. I read it. We have a different interpretation of it, and that's where I keep getting to this sticking point. Because from where I sit, and I've been told that I'm just not a reasonable person, or that I must not be, or that I'm not reading it correctly, or that I'm not interpreting it correctly, from where I sit, there are these problems. And when they're raised, the answer is, you just don't get it, but I do. And this is why we have 1,000 or more denominations that all identify as Christian that disagree on every single point of doctrine. What are the odds that any of them got it right anywhere?